All right, so welcome to week 4, and we're going to finish up our discussion of Joshua. And once again, I'm going to show you more into how these biblical texts are designed to teach us theology in the midst of history. So once again, we do not have histories, we only have historians. We only have the record of which they're trying to describe to us how these historical events happened and why that matters to these individuals. So I have 3 main objectives in this lecture of week 4 in our last part of Joshua, is to first explain to you this phrase, be strong and courageous, and how it kind of fits through Deuteronomy up into Joshua and its contextual factors. And then I want to look at Joshua's farewell speech, his farewell speech, and specifically just talk about some of the theological ideas that are contained within that. And then one theological idea in his last section on him renewing the covenant with Israel in the context by which he wants to go about renewing the covenant, and give you a glimpse into the importance of the covenant that he wants to renew before he passes away and leaves the earth and leaves Israel open to another leader who's going to come and take over. So one important aspect here is that in Joshua, there's a sense of what's called an inclusio, or the ideas that occur at the beginning of the book also appear close to the end of the book. And Harris kind of points out one of these when he talks about the connections between Joshua 1 and Joshua 23. So you're going to say God's gracious deeds build the confidence of the people for their future challenges. Joshua returns to the words of Joshua 1, spoken before the tribes began to take the west bank of Jordan. And the connection here is the phrase that we're going to talk about, the be strong and courageous, that Joshua returns to that once again at the end of the book. All right, so most people are familiar with the phrase be strong and courageous in Joshua chapter 1, but they fail to connect that with how this idea progresses, starting with Moses and then repeating the words that Moses has spoken. God repeats those again, even though these words came from God from the beginning. So the first time this occurs is in Deuteronomy 3:28, and this is Moses explaining what God had already said to him. So God said to Moses, but charge Joshua and encourage and strengthen him. That's the same Hebrew words there for be strong and courageous. For he shall go over at the head of this people, and he shall put them in the possession of the land that you shall see. And then that's near the beginning of Moses's speech in Deuteronomy. And then later, Moses comes back and does the same thing where he gives it to all of Israel. And he was talking to all of Israel in chapter 3, but here he's going to talk to all of Israel about that same phrase. So he's going to say to Israel, be strong and courageous. Do not fear or be in dread of them, of the nations of which God has sent them to conquer. For it is the Lord your God who goes with you, and he will not leave you or forsake you. And then Moses summons Joshua, and he does this in the sight of all of Israel. And this broader charge that was given to Israel is more specifically given to Joshua. Be strong and courageous, for you shall go with this people into the land that the Lord your God has sworn to their fathers to give them, and you shall put them in possession of it. It is the Lord who goes before you. He will be with you. He will not leave you or forsake you. Do not fear or be dismayed. And then once again, he's going to repeat this again after the Song of Moses, or kind of closer to the end of this section. Sorry, he's going to do it again after the Song of Moses. But then the Lord is going to commission him officially and say these same sort of words that Moses has now repeated. Be strong and courageous, for you shall bring the people of Israel into the land that I have sworn to give them. I will be with you. And then you get this statement once again, a repetition from the end of Deuteronomy, and then at the beginning of Joshua, in Joshua chapter 1, verses 67, be strong and courageous, only be strong and courageous. I will be with you. You will have success wherever you go, so long as you're keeping the law that I have given my servant Moses. So the idea being is the same charge that Moses had started off with, that God had given to him, but at some point in time that we didn't know because this wasn't explained to us, Moses then repeats at least 3 times to make sure that this gifting is heard, and then God himself repeats it twice here to make sure that Joshua has it. All right, so within the context of Joshua, the phrase "be strong and courageous" is not only applied to Joshua. Joshua does the same thing that Moses did. So, like Moses did in Deuteronomy chapter 31, where he went from the broad people of Israel to specifically to Joshua. This starts off specifically to Joshua, and then it's spoken to the broad community of believers, or the people of Israel who were supposed to be ideally believers. In Joshua 10:25, when they're fearful and they think they're going to kind of be destroyed in this context, Joshua makes it very clear to them of this same sort of promise. Do not be afraid or dismayed. Be strong and courageous, for thus the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight, knowing that God is going to be on their side. And so Harris is just going to bring up, even though you only just have one of the words here, he's going to say the same sort of ideas at the conclusion of the book, where Joshua is going to make it very clear that they need to be very strong to keep and do all that is written in the law of Moses, the same thing that was told to Joshua at the beginning of the book, turning aside neither to the right or to the left, same thing said to Joshua, that you do not mix with these nations remaining among you, or make mention of the names of their gods, or swear by them, or serve them, or bow down to them. If the Lord is the one who has delivered them, why would they want to do this? There's some contextual reasons why we fall into sin and fall into worshiping other gods, but Joshua makes it very clear that we can be steadfast because of the fact that God himself is with us to guide us and to lead us through such times. So I'll conclude with this quote from Harris as he kind of concludes this section. He's going to say, believers will turn away from competitors of their God and at the same time bind themselves completely to their God. True strength includes obedience to God without wavering before temptations. Separation from temptation is the first step towards faithfulness. There's always going to be things that are going to be in the way that want to tempt us, but if we want to live and act and be faithful, we need to separate ourselves from these things in a variety of different ways, which requires a lot of wisdom on our part to look at who we are internally so that we can project faithfulness externally and internally by avoiding external temptations that can lead us away from faithfulness. All right, so now that we've talked about the phrase "be strong and courageous," we're now going to move into Joshua's farewell speech, and I'm going to nuance some of that more as it kind of appeals to that speech more broadly. All right, so it's easy to hear from people, avoid temptation, avoid temptation, avoid temptation. But what is one of the motivating factors that should help us avoid temptation, and one of the things that we should do to help us avoid temptation? Well, one of those is given here in Joshua 23:3. He's going to say, and you have seen all that the Lord your God has done to all these nations for your sake, for it is the Lord your God who has fought for you. Now, in one sense, we can do the same thing. We can read through the book of Joshua, see all that has happened, and say, if God did this for them, he can also do it for us. But we're not left with that only. So keep in mind that this was also the case before Joshua was a leader, when Moses was a leader. Moses wanted to make it very clear to them in Deuteronomy 4:9, only take care and keep your soul diligent, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, unless you depart from your heart all the days of your life, unless they depart from your heart all the days of your life. Make them known to your children and your children's children. So in a sense, our parents, our father figures in the faith should also be telling us about the things God has done for them, and that should inspire us to avoid temptation, to stay faithful to God, to stay strong and courageous, to wait it out, because we know that God is faithful. So similarly, you get the same thing in Psalm 44 verses 1-2. This would have been after or during the exile or something like that much later. That's where the sons of Korah would have been those who wrote this around the time that David was king, but this probably didn't get finalized into the canon of scripture until after the exile. So they say, "Oh God, we have heard with our eyes. Our fathers have told us what deeds you performed in their days, in the days of old. You with your own hand drove out the nations, but they you planted. You afflicted the peoples, but them you set free. But them you planted, but them you set free." So the idea being is what God has done for our fathers, we can also embrace ourselves. And this, once again, even goes into the New Testament, where the apostles make it very clear that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life. The life was made manifest, and we have seen it and testified to it and proclaimed to you the eternal life, which was with the Father and was made manifest to us. That which we have seen and heard we proclaim also to you, so that you too may have fellowship with us. Indeed, our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. So the point here being is, all throughout Scripture, from Old to New Testament, there's this testimony that the things that have been seen by others and experienced by others also can be, in a sense, seen and experienced by us if we will listen to them and heed their calls. We didn't have to see Jesus himself to also feel the impact of Jesus on our lives, and we didn't have to see the Exodus events or the events that are happening in Joshua to have the impact of those in our lives. God has worked in history to move things in such a way that all things will be good for his people, despite what circumstances may tell us. Sometimes we just need to be diligent, strong, and courageous, and avoid things that are going to tempt us to forsake God, thinking somehow something else is going to do something better than what God himself has chosen to do. Now, with that being said, you can also look at your own life, whether it's from when you were a kid or as you got older, or whatever the case may be. I'm sure there are things you can point to in your own life that you have experienced that have shown that God has been providentially guiding you and keeping you. And when we are faced with moments of temptation, moments where we were drawn away from God, we should always turn back to those to remind us to be steadfast. So I'll just finish this off with just giving you the exact words here of Joshua. So he's going to say, okay, you've seen what God has done, and then he's going to go on to say what you've seen. I have allotted to you as an inheritance for your tribes those nations that remain, along with all the nations that I have already cut off, from the Jordan to the great sea in the west. The Lord your God will push them back before you and drive them out of your sight. So he's saying, because of what God has already done, God is going to also do something in the future, and you shall possess the land just as the Lord your God has promised. So they don't possess the land now. That's important to keep in mind. There's still enemies out there. There's still things that can tempt them. There's still things that could destroy them. But if they are faithful, God will continue to do this, because that's what God has planned for them. So then he's going to say our phrase here, therefore be very strong to keep and do all that is written in the law of Moses, turning aside neither to the right or to the left, and things that we've already read. So if you skip down to verse 8, but he's going to say, but you shall cling to the Lord your God, just as you have done to this day. The point here being is, if you can have clung to God now because of what he has done for you in the past, you can continue to cling to God for the future, even though you still have enemies and other things that are going to tempt you to walk away from the Lord. What he has already done for you and what he did for your fathers and for people before us should be enough to lead us forward, knowing that we can continue to trust him. That is one aspect of avoiding temptation to walk away from the Lord. So I will conclude with another statement here from Harris's commentary on Joshua 23. He's going to say the reported speech just suggests that the tribe should love God in response to God's saving power during the battles and continue a close relationship with God that began under the pressure of taking the land. It addresses human nature, which tends to lose its need to depend on God when a crisis subsides. There's always going to be peaceful moments that make us think that we can do things on our own. But we always need to remember that we need to depend on God regardless of the crisis that's taking place, or lack of crisis. All right, so be strong and courageous. Stand fast because of what God has done for you in the past. That's the point, one of the main points of Joshua's farewell speech there. So now we're going to move into this idea of renewing the covenant, and the idea that this takes place over every generation. You cannot depend on your forefathers' faith to guide you today. You can't depend on a friend's faith to guide you today, your pastor's faith to guide you today. For you as a person, you have to decide, I'm going to renew, in a sense, the covenant. I'm going to keep myself faithful to God. I'm going to take up the cross of walking with Christ. If you do not do something like that, what they have done in the past will not matter for how you're going to act in the future. So, in order to explain Joshua in this renewing of the covenant, I want to start here. So, if you go to Genesis 11, you will see that in verses 27 through 32, you're told this sort of charge from Terah, that you're told that Terah took his children and whatnot, and he set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. And when they came to Haran, they settled there, and Terah died. And this, you're told he died, but the reality is he doesn't die until Isaac is born, which is not until much later in time. And Isaac was roughly 35 when Terah died. And one of the questions you should ask is, well, why is that story even there? Why are we even told about what Terah's doing? Well, there's a parallel in Genesis 12, verses 1 through 9, to Terah and Abraham, and you get the same sort of thing Abraham took. They set out for the land of Canaan. They entered the land of Canaan. Abraham built an altar to the Lord, and he built an altar to the Lord and worshiped the Lord there. And the point here being is the same call that God put on Abraham originally was a call that he put on Terah, and Terah chose to disobey that call. So this is part of what Joshua is pointing out to the people in Joshua 24:2. He's going to say unto the people, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. The point here is very clear that Terah chose to worship other gods instead of choosing to worship God, even though Terah had the same call that Abraham had. Terah did not remain faithful. And so this commentary on Genesis by Abraham Kuravilla helps to flesh this out. He's going to say Terah's decision to settle there in Haran is an echo of what happened at Babel. Both the whole earth and Terah's household appear to have gotten it wrong. It would not be until Abraham's migration that the will of God is accomplished. Clearly, the author is contrasting the doubtful choice on Terah's part with the initiative and obedience of Abraham. And it's worth adding that Haran is Terah's son, and you're told also in that context that Terah's son Haran died, and then you get a place named Haran, and Terah stays there. So you can assume that Terah named the place Haran in honor of his son and chose to just stay there where his son had died, instead of continuing to follow the Lord despite some of the circumstances that he saw that were unpleasing to him, understanding that God's overall agenda is going to work things out. So here's just a quick diagram that lays this out as well. This is a form of what's called a chiastic sort of structure or a parallelistic structure. I like that term better, of how this lays itself out in the Genesis narratives. So Joshua is then going to return to the same idea at the end of his renewing of the covenant. He's going to say, now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in faithfulness. Put away the gods that your fathers served beyond the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. If it is evil in your eyes to serve the Lord, choose this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your father served in the region beyond the river and the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So Joshua is trying to make it very clear to them that he is going to follow in the path of Abraham and not just give in to anything else that could tempt him. Now he had a good role model in that Moses also already followed the Lord, and he had many other faithful people helping him, and that he was trying to guide Israel through, but he knows he's about to pass away, so he's trying to say, okay, I'm leaving, Eliezer is leaving, we're getting old, we're dying. Are y'all going to remain faithful to the Lord? Who are you going to follow? Your forefathers who served other gods, or your forefather Abraham who chose to live faithfully? And this also kind of rolls into, has an allusion to what Moses had already commanded them to do in Deuteronomy 10, verses 12 through 17. He's going to say, now Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? But to fear the Lord your God and walk in his ways, to love him and serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments and statutes of the Lord, which I am commanding you today for your good. So once again, keeping God's commandments is something that is good for us, even if it feels restricting in some ways. That's why we need to be strong and courageous and avoid temptation and trust that God's commandments are good. Behold, to the Lord your God belong heaven and the heavens of heaven and earth with all that is in it. He owns it all. So he commands it all to work in a way that is proper. Yet the Lord set his heart in love on your fathers and chose their offspring after them, you above all people, as you are this day. Circumcise therefore the foreskins of your heart, and do not be stubborn. That should be what they should want. Serve the Lord your God, or for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribes. We can trust that God has set things in motion in such a way that he is not biased. He's not doing this to favor one people group over another. He's not doing this to favor one particular person over another. He's not doing this to favor one set of ideals over another. He's saying, I am the creator of the heavens and the earth. I know how all things should function, and this is going to make everything prosperous if everyone will keep my commandments and statutes. But the problems occur when people do not do such things, and that throws the whole world out of balance. So we don't need to be the ones who are out of balance. We need to help bring everyone else into balance and into the standard of which God has set for us to walk in.